Let's talk about a year that completely changed the course of Indian history, 1857. This was the year India just erupted in this massive challenge to British rule. It was a moment that would reshape the entire subcontinent. But what do we actually call it? Was it just a mutiny? Or was it something way, way bigger? You know, the answer to that question is a real battleground. And today, we're diving right in.
And really, this is the big question, right? On one hand, you have the British perspective. They called it the Sepoy Mutiny. Now, that word mutiny makes it sound kind of small, like it was just a problem with some soldiers. But then, you have the Indian nationalist view, which calls it the First War of Independence. And that paints a totally different picture, the very beginning of a nation's fight to be free.
So you see, what we call it isn't just semantics, it's everything. The name itself is a fight for what this event even means. This was so much more than a simple rebellion. It was a defining moment, and the story you get really depends on who's holding the microphone, so to speak.
All right, so how did we even get here? What caused this massive uprising? Well, you have to imagine mid-19th century India as a giant tinderbox, just packed with grievances, waiting for a single spark to set it all off.
And that fuel for the fire? It was coming from pretty much everywhere. Let's break it down into 4 key areas. First, you've got politics. Local rulers were losing their power, their lands just taken away. Then economics. British policies were just devastating for local artisans and farmers. Third, the military. Indian soldiers, the sepoys, were facing constant discrimination. And finally, you have social and religious issues. A lot of people felt the British were messing with their culture and their faith. I mean, it was a total perfect storm of anger.
And here's a perfect example of a policy that just made people furious, the Doctrine of Lapse. This was basically a clever political tool the British used to just swallow up Indian states. The rule was, if a local king died without a natural-born son, his kingdom didn't go to an adopted heir. Nope, he was just absorbed into British India. Game over. This is exactly how places like Jhansi and Satara were taken. And suddenly you have these really powerful, really angry former rulers with a huge axe to grind.
But here's where it gets a little more complex. The historian R.C. Majumdar makes a really important point. He says that while the political anger was absolutely everywhere, it wasn't like everyone was fighting for one single unified India just yet. You had different groups fighting for their own reasons. The one thing that tied them all together? A common enemy.
So, with all this tension simmering just below the surface, all it needed was that one spark. And that spark came in the form of a new rifle cartridge for the Enfield rifle. Now, to load this thing, soldiers had to literally bite the end of the cartridge off. And a rumor just spread like wildfire that the grease on these cartridges was made from cow fat, which is sacred to Hindus, and pig fat, which is forbidden for Muslims. For the soldiers, this wasn't a small thing. This was a direct attack on their faith.
And this is a key distinction another historian, Eric Stokes, makes. He argues that religion wasn't really the root cause of the whole thing. It was the mobilizing force. Think of it this way. The cartridge issue was the final straw. It was the one thing that got everyone fired up and gave them a powerful shared reason to finally act on all those other problems that have been building up for years.
Okay, so the spark has lit the fuse. Let's look at how this thing exploded into a full-blown uprising. The rebellion spread incredibly fast, moving from army bases out into the countryside, but as you'll see, its path was just as difficult as its beginnings.
Now, this revolt didn't have one single leader. It was more like a constellation of leaders, each in their own region, mostly across North India. In Delhi, you had the elderly Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who became a really important symbol for the rebels. Over in Kanpur, Nana Sahib was in charge. In Jhansi, of course, the legendary Rani Lakshmi Bai led the fight. And then you had Begum Hazrat Mahal in Lucknow and Kunwar Singh in Bihar. These were the faces of the resistance.
So, the big question is, why did it ultimately fail? Well, the rebels were incredibly brave, no doubt about it, but they were at a massive disadvantage. Think about it. They had no unified leadership, their coordination was spotty at best, and their weapons were often outdated. On the flip side, you have the British. They were a well-oiled military machine, they had superior organization, they had the telegraph to communicate instantly, and, this is a big one, they had the support of some really powerful Indian princely states like Hyderabad and Kashmir.
And that brings us back to R.C. Majumdar, who really puts his finger on the core problem for the rebels. He said it wasn't one single unified war. It was more like a bunch of separate local uprisings that just happened to be going on at the same time. Sure, they all had the same enemy and similar problems, but they didn't have that one single vision, that one ideology to glue them all together and make them truly unstoppable.
But here's the thing.
Just because the revolt failed, it doesn't mean things went back to the way they were. Not at all. In fact, it triggered a complete transformation in how Britain ruled India. The aftermath was in many ways just as significant as the uprising itself.
The first big change was immediate and huge: the end of the British East India Company. I mean, think about that for a second. For about 100 years, a private company had been ruling an entire subcontinent. That's wild. Well, in 1858, that was over. The British Crown stepped in and took direct control. This is the official start of what we call the British Raj. They even created a new government job, the Secretary of State for India, just to manage it.
The British definitely learned some lessons from this, and they made some major policy changes to make sure it never happened again. First, they completely reorganized the army. They upped the ratio of British soldiers to Indian soldiers, and, crucially, put all the heavy artillery exclusively under British command. They also made a big public promise to stop interfering with local religious and social customs, and they got rid of those aggressive annexation policies like the Doctrine of Lapse that had made so many rulers angry.
But honestly, the biggest change wasn't something you could write down in a law book. It was psychological. The revolt left behind this deep, ugly scar of racial distrust between the British and Indians. And for the Indian people, even though it failed, the memory of 1857 became this incredibly powerful symbol. It planted the seeds for an organized, nationwide independence movement that would really start to grow just a few decades later. And that brings us right back to where we started. The fight over what 1857 actually means didn't just stop when the fighting did. It's a battle for memory that's still going on today. And how we remember it says just as much about who we are now as it does about what happened back then.
So let's look at the classic colonial view, which Sir John Lawrence summed up perfectly. He called it a mutiny, not a revolution. By using the word mutiny, they were deliberately downplaying it, right? They were framing it as a simple problem of army discipline. Just a few bad apples, a few disloyal soldiers, and not what it might have been, a huge popular uprising against their entire system of rule.
But then, fast forward to 1909. An Indian nationalist named V.D. Savarkar comes along and completely flips the script. He's the one who calls it the First War of Independence. And with that one phrase, he reframed the entire event. For him, and for generations of Indian nationalists who came after him, 1857 wasn't a failed mutiny. It was the heroic beginning of the long, hard fight for freedom.
And it doesn't stop there. There are other ways to look at it too. Take Karl Marx, for example. He was writing about it as it happened, and he saw it through a totally different economic lens. For Marx, this was a popular revolt of the masses against the brutal economic exploitation of colonialism. He saw it as a class struggle just as much as a national one.
Modern historians, though, they're kind of moving beyond these single big labels. They're digging into the micro-histories, the smaller stories. They're asking questions like, how did peasants actually organize themselves? How did people pass secret messages using symbols, like flatbreads and lotus flowers? And what was the absolutely crucial and often overlooked role that women played in all of this?
So where does that leave us? After looking at all of this, the causes, the leaders, why it failed, the aftermath, and all these competing ways of remembering it, what was the revolt of 1857? Was it a mutiny? A war of independence? A popular revolt? Well, the truth is, it was probably a little bit of all of those things, but not perfectly any one of them. It was definitely more than a mere sepoy mutiny, but it also wasn't a fully formed modern nationalist war like we might think of today. What it was a complex, messy, multi-layered resistance that grew out of 100 years of deep-seated grievances. And maybe, in the end, its true significance isn't that it failed, it's that it happened at all. It created this powerful legacy, this memory of resistance, that would echo for generations and ultimately light the way for India's freedom struggle.